Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this year's summer school. I see many familiar faces, but I see also some new faces, younger faces. Hope that's the trend of the future. And also, of course, we like to have our long-standing students who come every year to support us. Let me introduce you to Dr. Anna Selmeczi. Am I saying that correct? She hails from Hungary, by the way, in case you didn't know. She's been in South Africa now for how long have you been? You've been here quite a while, eh? 5 years, okay. Anna is based at the African Center for City at UCT. The African Center for Cities is based in the Environment and Geographical Faculty. Anna's work focuses on, her urban studies research is very much grounded in social and political theory. Anna is a great theorist, so she's going to talk, I think her talk is going to be influenced by a lot of theory as well. Is your hand up for something? Sorry. Oh, you're just pointing your finger. Oh, sorry. So Anna's work, as I said, is grounded in social and political theory. And in particular, she focuses on the connections between urban spatial ordering and knowledge production. She's also interested in how different forms of popular politics contest and transform these orders of spatial planning. Anna has also taught at the African Center for Cities, eh? EGSA, okay. She's taught a course on space and politics, contesting the city and the site of the public. Welcome, Anna, to your first course at our summer school, and she's one of our youngest lecturers this year. So give her a big hand. It's her first time at summer school. Okay, let me just...
Okay.
Have you got a pocket?
Yeah, in the back. It does. Yeah. This is... I'm not used to this. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Not really? Yes? Yeah? Okay. Just tell me if I should speak up. Thank you, Zuleika. See you later. Okay, very nice to meet all of you. It's a classical lecture hall setting, so I'm not expecting everyone to introduce themselves, and that would be also taking away lots of time. So I'll just jump straight into it. And then maybe tomorrow or at any time, actually, if during the class you didn't get your comment or question in, just come here and we can chat. I'll be here a little bit after the classes as well. Also, there's a little bit of time left at the end of each lecture for you to ask questions, but if there's something pressing, I don't mind if you pose your question during the lecture, if it's relevant to what I was just saying. So you have probably seen the outline of this short course, which is that today I'm going to introduce the concept of gentrification, give a little bit of history of the concept and the process, more than the concept actually, and then focus in on what gentrification looks like in the global south, just a tiny bit, and then a little bit more about how it looks in South Africa and Cape Town in particular. And then tomorrow, we'll talk about the aesthetics of gentrification. That will include two main themes. One is the crucial and specific role that artists and related professions have in furthering gentrification in cities everywhere, including Cape Town, but also spending more time on talking about what is the aesthetics of gentrification, how does it look, how does it feel, how does it taste. You only have to think about all the coffee roasteries to get an idea of the actually existing aesthetics or sensibility of gentrification. And then our last lecture will focus on public art, so looking at aesthetics in a more narrow sense of art, but still mindful of how art is contextualized in this broader sensibility of gentrification, and look at how art can either contest or further gentrification. And we'll look into a few specific and concrete examples from Cape Town to see how that works. All right, so any questions about that, the structure so far? Okay. Then I thought it's actually interesting, although I'm sure many of you have background knowledge about gentrification, and I would personally love to ask each one of you why you're interested in the course, but again, I unfortunately don't have the time for that. But if you are willing to share, I'm here and very happy to hear about it. So the etymology of the word, of course, is related or derives from the idea or the notion of gentry. The gentry, this particular class, people of good social position, specifically in the UK, the class, that will be relevant, that it's specifically in the UK, the class of people next below the nobility in position and birth. So they're the second best, in a sense. And that, as I said, will be important. This positioning socially, but also geographically, as we'll come to, I just turned that off, as we'll come to look into the history of the concept. This one is a more recent definition of gentrification. It's quite a dense definition, but it does include all the main features of gentrification, so I thought, why not start with that? Gentrification is an economic and social process whereby private capital and individual homeowners and renters reinvest in fiscally neglected neighborhoods through housing, and then eventually reconfiguring the neighborhood landscape of consumption. There again, just a flag for the relationship between consumption and aesthetics, and residence by displacing poor and working class residents. That is generally the process. Now, what's important to note here is, like I said, this is a recent definition of gentrification, and that we can see in the fact that it includes not only the rehabilitation of old buildings in formerly neglected neighborhoods, but also newly built developments, which was not included in conceptualizations of gentrification when it began, with Ruth Glass, who was the first urbanist theorist that talked about, she was the one who coined the notion, the concept of gentrification, going back to that noun of gentry that I showed you. That was in 1964, as you can see, and in the UK, in London. So she first wrote about she took note of the changes that she experienced when walking through London. I'm going to be a bad teacher and turn this off while I'm talking to you. Sorry, I don't like PowerPoints, by the way, but for quotes, it's really, really helpful. So Ruth Glass observed the changes in London after the Second World War, where first, so I have two slides, and the second one will include the more or less definition of gentrification. The first one, she just noticed moving through central London how flashy it has become, how old and dodgy Italian coffee shops have been replaced by boutiques, and how even the packaging of food changed, and new hotels popped up, and in general, there was a new sense of affluence redefining central London. So that's what she states, there's a gleam of affluence in most of central London and in many of the suburbs. Again, I'm happy to send you all of this if you give me your email addresses or in any other form that works for you. So don't worry if you don't take note of all of this. And this is the part of the essay where she actually coins the notion of gentrification, talking about the displacement that happens gradually as the backlash of the appearance of this affluence that I mentioned. One by one, many of the working class quarters of London have been invaded by middle classes and upper and lower. So, like I said, what we now call the first wave of gentrification that Ruth Glass identified was about people, and mostly private people, buying property and then refurbishing that. With that refurbishment, new services start to appear in the area to accommodate for the tastes of the middle class. Again, this is very much about, or a lot of it is about, consumption choices. If stores need to cater for the tastes of middle classes, then older ones that served the working class populations will not find their market anymore. They'll have to move out. So this is a whole series of processes that eventually displace working class populations. Once most of the houses in an area are upgraded, refurbished, that also means that rate revenues increase, and the propertied people will have more of a say in what happens to the area, but let's not jump too far ahead. Any questions so far? This is very gentrification 101, so sorry if it's too basic, but you never know. So reflecting back on this process, over 30 years later, Neil Smith, who is one of the key thinkers of urban change in the 20th century and beyond, thinks about the history of gentrification, and as much as he draws on Ruth Glass, he also notes that there were precursors of the process beforehand. And this one is based on a poem from Charles Baudelaire, which I thought was quite expressive of the day-to-day encounters, actually, of gentrification, when, as Ruth Glass noted, the old and the new live side by side. Also, the rich and the poor live side by side, at least for that period of transition. And I don't think that Capetonians have to be explained what that feels like or what that looks like on an everyday level. So Baudelaire, sitting on a boulevard, in a boulevard cafe in Paris, at the end of the 19th century, lit by the newly introduced gaslight, sits there with his lover, and the poem is dedicated to the process of estrangement, when he realizes that instead of sympathizing with the poor people that pass by and look at the spectacle of consumption, doesn't sympathize that his lover doesn't sympathize with the poor people, instead wants them or asks the narrator to get these people away from here. And the reason why I emphasized that bit in the quote was that a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago, there was a video circulating on YouTube that was made in Cape Town by 3 journalists based in Langa, photographers and journalists who went on a so-called reverse township tour around Cape Town. And what they did was they wanted to look at how people react, patrons of fancy places in Cape Town, fancy coffee shops and other areas, just residents of high-class, mostly inaccessible areas, how they feel if they are subjected to the same process of objectification through video recordings and photos taken of them, just like it happens when although it's mostly tourists, but middle and upper class, mostly white people go into townships and seeking a unique experience, take photos of people who live there and take photos of their everyday reality. And so at one of these coffee shops or restaurants in Camps Bay, one of the patrons turns to the security guard and asks him precisely this: can you take these people away from here? Which is just, I thought at least, a very powerful and sad continuity or repetition that is for us to find out what it is actually that happens. Is it a repetition? Is it a continuation? How come social dynamics manifesting through urban change, urban renewal, exert the same kind of reactions in Cape Town in 2015, say? Slightly more famous author, Friedrich Engels, also took note of processes similar to gentrification already at the end of the 19th century when he was writing his series of articles called The Housing Question. That was in 1872-73. And again, Neil Smith, who's a Marxian thinker, Marxian, Engelsian, I guess, draws on his thought to prove that, yes, Ruth Glass was right to coin a definition about a process that was happening that she could perceive in the post-war period of London, but similar processes happened before that. Engels didn't call it gentrification, he called it Houseman, referring to the key person responsible for the modernization of Paris. And not only for the that modernization process also included the secularization of Paris, making Paris amenable to effective policing, as much as rendering it into a spectacle itself, a destination of world fairs, etc. That was already the beginning of the emergence of the so-called global city that later in the 20th century Saskia Sassen theorizes about. We'll get back to that, don't worry. So he referred to this process as Houseman, and as you can read there, it's the practice similarly centered on displacement. No matter how different the reasons may be, the result is everywhere the same. Most scandalous alleys and lanes disappear to the accompaniment of lavish self-glorification by the bourgeoisie on account of this tremendous success. Previously neglected poor areas are being refurbished, renovated, their inhabitants displaced. Okay. So again, while taking note of these previous processes, Neil Smith says it is true that, that after the Second World War there was a boom in urban renewal, which justifies why Ruth Glass took note of particular of these kinds of changes. That was, but sorry, I missed one step, which was that gentrification continued into or appeared even before the Second World War, mostly in European and West European cities. In some cities of the United States as well, but in the 1930s and 40s, he argues it was still sporadic. It was much more of an exception than the norm of urban changes. And it was only after the Second World War and all the changes in the economy that were due, of course, to how economies were affected by the war economy, that gentrification became more general, much more frequent, and it entered a phase of continuity and expansion. And so from Europe, so the expansion was across the West first, meaning that from Western Europe it spread into the United States. It's a question, of course, whether it makes sense to think in terms of spreading. And that's a question that will become even more relevant when we think about gentrification in the global South, how helpful it is to think about these processes as spreading from the North to the South. But I'll get back. Michelle. That's a really, really useful question. So Ruth Glass talks about, and I'll mainly be able to contain my answer through focusing on what she says about London. That she says London developed in this period after the Second World War due to a set of trials and errors. So as much as there was, of course, urban planning, but a lot of the urban planning processes in London were not able to counter or even probably consider these processes. So she talks about by the end of, in the mid-60s, the public planning with an interest or aiming to affect urban changes with people in mind, so kind of a social democratic sense of public planning of the 40s and 50s have been left behind, and I guess in an early, according to an early-ish shift to more private capital focus or more market competition oriented urban planning gave way to private investments and drawing back some of the controls to controls that were at place with popular or more social democratic ideas of urban planning. So she says, again, as the way that appears was that, of course, low-cost housing, public housing buildings were still there, but you could already see in the 60s the appearance of office towers that were private investments, and that completely rearranged the landscape. So the two lived side by side and weren't exactly, there wasn't a smooth change between these two schools of planning. And also she says what happens related to the economic changes of the post-industrial city, that a different set of professionals, a different class of professionals moves into the center of the city, and as a result, working class people have to move further and further out, and anyone who have visited London knows that the places that people can afford are further and further away. You have to take the subway and travel an hour to get into central London. And she says that that too is this kind of sprawl of London is also the result of the lack of planning, keeping these processes in check.
Mm. So you say that we generally have rules like Mr. 6 and apartheid planning policy. But do you think that it was also following the worldwide trend of the inner city, poor people, which was District 6 and places? I think it was also because of that worldwide trend in what was happening.
So that had a number of shifts in South Africa. Of course, during the height of apartheid and the forced removals, there was this idea that the center must be white. But then there's a difference between how Johannesburg and Cape Town formed and has been reshaped post-apartheid. We'll talk about Woodstock as a special area, as an area that never actually faced forced removals, but it was in the 1980s and early 90s, basically till the early 2000s, the CBD in Cape Town was neglected and wasn't subject to gentrification. It was actually, as opposed, well, at that stage, it was similar to what happened in Johannesburg. So neither cities replicated at that stage the Western process, which was that the urban core is being retaken by the elite. And it's only, like I said, in the early 2000s that in Cape Town that starts to happen. And in Johannesburg, it's only today that starts to happen. But again, I'm running back and forth, so just let me know when it becomes incoherent, and I'm not going to be able to help it, but I'll try. But I was going to say that it was first, you could observe gentrification happening in the West and not only Western Europe. And then in what they call the second wave of gentrification, what Neil Smith refers to as such, is when not only central cities or metropolises were subject to gentrification, but also smaller towns of a few 100,000 people, both in the United States and in Europe, started to gentrify, and that was mostly in the 1970s when they could start to perceive that. And already then, or a decade later, in the 1980s, 1990s, one could observe similar processes, like I just said, in the global south. In Johannesburg, we will talk about Woodstock. Gentrification started in the late 80s, early 90s, due to different processes because of a different structure of the real estate market, but also because of the emergence of neoliberalism in South America, especially in a few countries of South America that were subject to the Chicago boys and their ideas of neoliberal economy. Gentrification happened quite clearly in some South American countries, such as Chile. And there, because of the role of neoliberalism and how that, or what kind of policies that entails, privatization, deregulation, decentralization, gentrification looked very, very similar to cities in the United States and in Western Europe. Now I can reveal this. So, and this is where Neil Smith says, of course, these economic changes and urban changes were due to political changes and the intertwining of social, political, and economic shifts, which was already in this period due to the appearance of, or the prevalence of neoliberalism as a set of policies and economic and financial practices. And this is also where there's just a nod to Saskia Sassen and her idea of global cities. So Neil Smith says, in this context of emerging neoliberalism and its manifestation in urban renewal processes, gentrification has become the hallmark of the emerging global city. But like I said, regional centers began to show the symptoms as well. Yes?
The way I'm processing it is gentrification is basically private with some facilitation from government. Slum clearance would be the government doing much the same thing, but politically from the government's point of view.
That's a very good point as well.
Is that, the terminologies.
Yeah.
They're basically doing much the same, moving the poor out and reprocessing the land and the buildings for other uses. But the word slum clearance would be coming from government and gentrification would be coming from private.
And this is exactly why it's important to see what it means for a city to become neoliberal, because when a city reconstructs itself and finds itself, especially in South Africa, in conflict with some of the national political aims of, for example, spatial desegregation or social equality, justice, that becomes very conflictual when cities have an idea that the way they can generate revenue, the way they can fund, let's say, spatial transformation is through the market and through private investment. So you're very right that gentrification, especially originally, was a privately induced process, and it happens through private investment. But we'll see in the case of Cape Town, for example, specifically in the case of the CBD, the hugest push towards gentrification was the formation of the Cape Town Partnership, which was a public-private partnership. When the city finally decided in the early 2000s that it has to do something, and it has to create the policy context for private investors to come and bring employment and services and reorder the city. And order, as you referred to here, is crucial. The ideas of order and particular ideas of order, especially in the global south, because of how our cities look, involves some clearance. And yeah, we'll refer back to that. Okay. So we are actually reaching the point when I wanted to start speaking about what this means in the global south. And the authors that I used to introduce us to that phenomenon are Roland Atkinson and Gary Bridge, two urban theorists, who drew heavily on the work by Neil Smith, both the 1998 book that I used here, as well as a more recent article from 2002 when Neil Smith argued that gentrification has become generalized. So his notion, Ruth Glass 2.0, is gentrification generalized. And by that, he means what I just said, is that gentrification appears across the globe and across the urban hierarchy, so in regional centers as well. And in that, or drawing on that, Atkinson and Bridge link gentrification to the phenomenon of globalization. So they look at how globalization might have provided the context for gentrification to appear in various cities all over the globe, which is pretty straightforward if you think about it, precisely because of the role of globalizing economy, the role of the prevalence of the neoliberal paradigm that had various reasons, including the oil crisis in the 1970s and all sorts of debt crises that followed after that. And especially in the global south, these crises resulted in the intensified role of Western financial institutions and the set of norms that they thought Southern economies need to restructure themselves and make themselves more efficient and eventually pay back the money, I assume. So due to the at least according to these authors, and I don't disagree, due to all these changes and the prevalence of the neoliberal economic or financial paradigm, gentrification is one of the symptoms or one of the processes included in globalization. But that borders on boring at this context. The reason why I still included these authors is that they also say that this is a neo-colonial process. So we should read gentrification as a manifestation of colonial or neo-colonial expansion. And they list three reasons or three elements of that, or justify that with reference to three processes. One of them is, I think, the one that is most closely related to the aesthetic aspect of this course, which is that that gentrification progresses or expands as a cultural force, partly. Gentrification expands as a cultural force. I'll show the slide in a minute. And as a cultural force, it privileges whiteness and class-based identities and preferences of a particular urban lifestyle. One of the agents of this move or this furthering or progress of gentrification as a cultural force is a hypermobile global elite not to blame probably a very small set of people globally, but they are the people who can travel, hop from Mumbai to Cape Town and then to DC and back, and claim claim almost the right or definitely a preference to enjoy the similar kinds of services in all of those cities. So that's related to the particular ways in which the economy works and in which economy and finance is despatialized through globalization. This sort of mobility becomes possible on the quite high steps of the social and economic ladder, and so this social class, however small, does leave its marks on urban consumption landscapes. So that's one. And the other, perhaps more straightforward way in which gentrification as a cultural force progresses is through tourism, and the way in which social media and visual media helps to project this urban aesthetic and is used to attract people who can afford that and who prefer to come to Africa but still have their flat white. And so, like me, I don't. But I'm vegan, so I'm even worse. Okay, so that was the first reason for reading gentrification as a neo-colonial process. The second one is the universalization of a certain form of deregulation. So moving from actual users or urbanites to the way we are governed, which is through particular forms of regulation, but mostly deregulation, according to liberalism, neoliberalism, through the naturalization of market discipline. So the naturalization of the principle of the economy being, or the rule of the economy being competitive market economies. And then thirdly, gentrification can be read as neo-colonial through the universalization, or with reference to the universalization of certain forms of public administration. And that again responds to a question earlier about the confluence between private and public, is when public administration has to cater for private interests and sells land previously flagged for or labeled for low-cost housing, etc. I mean, in Cape Town we have a number of cases. In the early 2000s, the province sold a home for elderly people and turned it into a fancy hotel. And I mean, yeah, so what that means for that area is very predictable. What this means in terms of public administration is, of course, restrictions in supply of land, which is, especially in the context of post-apartheid South Africa, crucial and has vast consequences because of the unevenness of the economy. Of course, the in-migration of people from rural areas or from other impoverished provinces where there aren't urban centers such as Cape Town or Johannesburg. The in-migration continues, but because there isn't more accessible available land and there isn't investment into low-cost housing, what results in the global south, not only in South Africa, but unfortunately we are a good example for that, is increased homelessness, the increased size of informal settlements on the margins of, mostly on the margins of city, because of course in city centers, due to gentrification and ideas of order, that sort of residence is discouraged and policed and penalized. So through that, just to emphasize one more and especially relevant effect of that is that colonial patterns of residence, colonial patterns of property ownership are reproduced, which is why Cape Town in the 21st century still feels very much like the colonial settlement because of how neoliberalism and the consequences of neoliberalism in the urban landscape fell straight into the patterns of segregation, first installed through colonialism and then through apartheid. So the quickness in which Cape Town and the CBD emerged as a gentrified global city is precisely because of the persistence of the previous urban landscape, very much shaped through racial inequality and discrimination. And that actually is the argument of put forward by David MacDonald, MacDonald for sure, but I'm not sure about the first name. Okay, thank you. Where he dedicates a whole book to the question of whether Cape Town is a global city. And as much as he debates the relevance of the idea of the global city and distinguishes Cape Town from other supposed global cities in the north, he says the reason why we still might argue that Cape Town is a global city is that it's a neoliberal city. And it's a neoliberal city that, it's a city that could emerge as neoliberal very quickly precisely because of its past as a colonial city. Okay, I'll just quickly show you this one, which was about the neo-colonial aspects, cultural force, deregulation, and public administration. And then it is, I'm definitely running out of time, but I'll do my best. Again, thinking about what gentrification in the global south means, Loretta Lee is an urban theorist that dedicates a lot of his work to that question, also from a perspective of, or mindful of the stakes of theorizing from the south. So not only okay, I set the alarm to make time for your questions. So just shut me down when you want to speak. So the reason why she goes beyond observing empirical differences between cities in the south and cities in the north, she says it's important to think from the south and challenge ideas of urban processes emanating from the north and arriving with a delay of decades to the south, meaning that all our theoretical tools are handed down. And so she challenges, in the context of gentrification, specifically, she says it's not that helpful to think about gentrification as spreading from, just to caricature the process, from London to the US and then lower down in US cities, and then finally arriving to the South. She says it's important to actually look at how urban renewal or urban development over a much longer historical period were interlinked. So how the fact that Cape Town as a colonial city played into the formation and the landscape of Occidental metropoles, which were related, of course, because of how economies were defined by resource extraction from the colonies. So colonial towns had to look, or cities had to look differently and were shaped differently. So there is and again, the fact that resource extraction didn't take place in London in the same form as it did here had a major impact on the way London looked or could be shaped, or Houseman could modernize Paris in a particular way because of the way the economy of France operated through North Africa and its colonies there and beyond that. So Loretta Lee just reminds us that it's not necessarily helpful to take the Western concept of gentrification and apply it to cities in the South. We have to know what the historical track record is and what are the idiosyncrasies of these cities beyond the history, actually. I have too many gadgets, yeah.
Obviously, back in the 1990s, the difference between Durban and Cape Town and how they positioned themselves from a tourism point of view actually reflects today in the structure in those cities. And that was a political decision. Durban decided to go tourist-wise for the low-end, low turnover, but high turnover, let's say, lots and lots more people, but at a much lower entry level. And Cape Town chose exactly the opposite. They decided to go for top-end tourists. And then for the cities, if you look at the two cities, they're both colonial, ex-colonial cities, but they look totally different. If you go to Durban downtown, the traders aren't in the buildings anymore. The traders are on the street. The buildings are all empty. And Durban's profile, tourism, and their offering from the trade is totally different to what is offered in Cape Town. So surely that political decision has seriously influenced those two cities who don't look the same at all.
Sure, and that's why I think it's important always, we can't really talk about gentrification in South Africa because of how different these cities are due to various socioeconomic reasons and factors. But I do want to add to what you're saying is that there is a crucial role to events such as the Football World Cup that took place in 2010 that affected all of these major cities in South Africa, and Durban took advantage of that event as it happens globally when there is a mega event such like that. The same sort of policing measures that Neil Smith, this thinker that I've been quoting today, refers to as revanchist measures appear, which is that there are quite violent cleanup events in all cities. And that's because however Durban conceptualized its investment in tourism, it's still very explicitly wanted to configure itself as a global city. So in the 2010, or in those years, even before that actually, I started to do research in Durban back in 2009, and I was very, because of the things that I was looking at, I was very interested in the discourse, public discourse of the city, and it was surprising how explicit this reference to becoming world-class and global was in the communication. Not to question what you're saying, I think those differences are very, very important, but there is a more general turn towards governing cities with an idea of the relationship between private investment and the ways in which cities can create the ideal milieu for the market. Okay, I still wanted to talk about gentrification in Cape Town, and very briefly, there are two authors that I used in preparation, Gustav Pfister and again, sorry, I don't remember first names except for Gustav, of course. They talk about gentrification, or the discourse on gentrification in South Africa, and with a focus on Cape Town in two phases. The one is in the late 80s, early 90s, when people, some authors, although very few, took the idea of Western gentrification and applied it to Cape Town. One of those authors is Jane Garside, who looked at the case of Woodstock. And Woodstock, she thought, was special, and it was special because even though it was it used to be a very socially, racially, ethnically, otherwise diverse community, it never was, forced removals never happened. So it lived in this state of limbo for probably libido too, limbo for decades, and it was only in 1986, in reaction to all sorts of intensive political unrest all over Cape Town, especially in its so-called colored neighborhoods, that the city decided to effect forced removals, but it never happened because of the popular contestation and because of the sense that increasingly towards the end of that decade, but definitely in the early 90s, people had the idea that the Group Areas Act will be withdrawn and spatial apartheid will end soon. So how does that relate to gentrification? It relates because middle-class, so-called colored families started to move back closer to the city from Mitchell's Plain and other areas where they were displaced to, because they sensed a certain loosening of spatial apartheid, and they moved into lower Woodstock because that was predominantly colored, as opposed to upper Woodstock that was predominantly white. And as a result, because they were wealthier than the current population there, the same sort of displacement happened that Ruth Glass defined as gentrification. When they started moving in, rents were increased, etc. In parallel to that process, white middle-class families started to take over lower and working class white and other ethnic immigrant families in upper Woodstock. And here Garside observes also the in-migration of the usual suspects, artists and other creative professionals, intellectuals for whom the various residential choices that Woodstock offered warehouses, other forms of buildings that you wouldn't find in other suburbs in Cape Town, found that appealing, and again, that replacement of working class population happened. So there was this sort of gentrification happening, although it was very contained to this particular area. And it was only at the end of 90s and the early 2000s that people started to observe a different kind of gentrification that we can identify as the third wave of gentrification, when it's not only that old buildings are being refurbished and taken over by private property owners, but there are new investments, new developments purposefully built in areas that were previously neglected, but for much wealthier audiences and investors. And this is when so first, you could observe this in the Waterkant and also in Lower Gardens, according to Nico Kotzi, I think Nico, yeah, Kotzi, who is the co-author of this article. But then, like I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the 2000s, the CBD starts to gentrify as well. And this is why the authors, or the way that happened, illustrates that this is indeed the third and, in fact, the fourth wave of gentrification. The third wave because new developments happen, because previous office buildings are rebuilt, repurposed as accommodation in the city center. A lot of those old office buildings, starting with Mutual Heights, which is this beautiful Art Deco building, in the early 2000s, residential accommodation appeared, and a lot of the other old office buildings around that area on Batenkant Street and all over. There's a very useful map in the article that I'm happy to share. You can go on a gentrification tour after the course, if you will. What does fourth wave of gentrification mean? It means, again, in response to your question, it's very relevant. The fourth wave is when city leadership endorses the idea of gentrification and by absolutely committing itself to attracting private investment, invests in cleaning up the city. So the Cape Town Partnership that I mentioned was formed in the early 2000s and created precisely the conditions for restructuring, rebuilding, cleaning up the CBD. It was through the Cape Town Partnership that the Central City Improvement District, CCID, was created, and drawing on the increasing revenue that ratepayers moving in could afford, started to police and clean up the central